firmly returning the stallholder's handshake and bidding a warm farewell until his next trip into the market. Starke turned and then carried on along his way. He had only lived in the foothills that sat near the town for the past 6 months, but had made a point of ingratiating himself with as many of the local merchants as possible. Spending a full day moving between the various traders and vendors was by far the most effective way to keep abreast of this country's ever-changing political landscape. The German had temporarily resided in a number of different Middle Eastern nations since the end of the war, usually forced to move on by circumstances far beyond his control. On some occasions, this was the result of an unexpected or unwanted change of regime. For others, the interest of organisations or individuals with a hostile agenda. But as always, as a direct consequence of his previous wartime service within the ranks of the Waffen-SS. He had been stunned as the rest of his unit in the dying days of the conflict, when their commanding officer had announced his intention to surrender. Such an act had seemed suicidal, considering the evils they had committed during the rest of the war, with a trial and execution the only realistic outcome. As a result, when the colonel had set off in search of the nearest Allied unit, less than half of his surviving command had followed him. Instead, Starke and the rest of his fellow officers had fled the approaching enemy, along with any potential repercussions for their actions. Their escape had been far from easy, passing along a series of insecure and poorly maintained refugee networks before attaining the relative safety of the Mediterranean. For a brief time, he had found employment in Egypt and Syria, both countries desperate for experienced military officers to help raise their new armies. But time and again, the former SS major's past had suddenly loomed large, forcing him to seek a safer home and new employment. This was how he'd come to be involved in the sales of illegal arms to the growing resistant movement in the neighbouring country of Algeria, and most likely the reason why the young man he had noticed watching him from afar just over an hour before was still trailing along behind him as he made his way through the market. With one hand still clamped firmly around the butt of the pistol he was concealing in his jacket pocket, the Frenchman watched on as his target meandered along ahead of him. When the old man had come to a halt yet again, he thought for a moment he'd been noticed, before surmising it was just another conversation with another local trader. Outwardly, his quarry resembled many other Europeans who'd settled in this part of the world, advancing in both years and the amount of weight he was carrying, displaying little sign of the horrendous misdeeds he'd allegedly perpetrated over the continent only a decade before. But in truth, Sacha Guillot had little interest in this man's past crimes, or indeed the war itself. He'd been young during the conflict, with only a distant recollection of when British bombers had inadvertently bombed his hometown. There were also vague memories of his mother's indignation when the local priest had allowed a number of German soldiers to be laid to rest in their cemetery. But all of that seemed a lifetime ago, with no tangible link to the work he'd since been ordered to undertake for the French government. In the chaos of the post-war landscape, he'd been fortunate enough to fall into the employment of the French Secret Service, gathering intelligence on potential assets and targets. But an allegation of sexual assault by the daughter of a superior had resulted in him being sidelined from the agency, for a time, left out in the wilderness. The summons to the colonel's office had been unexpected, but welcome. If he could locate and eliminate this man, a former Nazi executioner, all sins would be forgiven. Like most who moved in his circles, Guillot was aware of the clandestine activities that Jacques Morlan and his subordinates carried out. State-sponsored abductions and murders, all under the cover of a fictional terror group named the Red Hand. The war in Algeria was not going well, largely as a result of the enemy using weapons provided by men such as the one he was following. Covert efforts to eliminate these arms dealers using car and letter bombs had proven ineffective, prompting a more personal response. But to Guillot, such details were unimportant. For him, the death of this man meant salvation and a return to the fold, nothing more. Taking care not to unduly quicken his pace, Horst Starke began to thread his way through the various market stalls, periodically checking that his pursuer was still following. There were a number of potential avenues available to him for dealing with this situation, including creating a very public distraction or proceeding directly to the local authorities in search of aid. But both these options risked attracting further unwanted attention to his current means of employment, so he had selected a far different course of action. The circles in which the former officer moved often exposed him to acts of hostility, largely because of the work he now did, as opposed to any historic reason. But it had been efforts like that, such as the letter bomb that had killed his secretary, or the drive-by shooting in Damascus, that seemed to have given him a sixth sense for danger. And so, as he fought hard against the part of his consciousness that screamed at him to flee, he finally cleared the marketplace and began to head down towards the docks. There was a skill to this game, one it had taken him time and effort to master, and that he had managed to keep him alive thus far. To maintain this pursuit by remaining within the eye line of his opponent, but to be the one who dictated both the pace and the final destination of the pursuit. Feeling confident the figure that was now emerging from the throng behind him was not yet emboldened enough to attack, he continued to stick to the town's busier streets. It was when he was finally within eyesight of his goal, the German turned off the main thoroughfare into a maze of alleys that ran down through the heart of the docks, ensuring his pursuer observed his every turn and leaving the door to the warehouse insecure behind him after he'd entered. It was only now that the former SS man's pace quickened, hurrying past the shelves that were laden with weaponry and ammunition, the same weapons he'd used over a decade before, directly into the centre of the cavernous building, before coming to a halt and turning to await the inevitable confrontation. Pausing for a second, Guillaume cautiously surveyed the large warehouse his quarry had now disappeared inside. Despite its size, the building seemed as anonymous as the many others it sat amongst, the German seemingly unhurried, unaware of his presence as he'd entered. One hand resting on the pistol, he tentatively approached the main door, heartened to find it insecure and ajar when he arrived. The building's interior was poorly lit, the sun struggling to stream in through the dirty skylights above. But from what he could see, the rooms he moved through contained shelves laden with rifles and submachine guns. These then opened out into a much larger space, with various misshapen boxes and packing crates stacked up around the outside of the room, the German standing in the centre, apparently waiting for him. His eyes scanned the room's perimeter. The Frenchman then cautiously moved forwards, gun up and aimed directly at the man who stood waiting patiently before him. When his quarry spoke, it was in English, inquiring who it was who'd sent his pursuer, if there was some possibility that the inevitable bloodshed could somehow be avoided. Guillaume's reply, when it came, was mocking. The arms dealer's crimes had brought him in direct opposition to the French government. He was long overdue. What was coming to him? He watched on, as Starke sighed, seeming to accept his situation, before asking if he could be allowed one last cigarette before the sentence was carried out. Finding himself impressed with this apparently stoic attitude, Guillaume agreed, watching on as the condemned man produced a small metal case from inside one of his jacket pockets. But the item that was produced inside was no cigarette, the light reflecting instead off a precious green stone set into a metal housing of some kind. With one quick action, the German had thrust the object down hard into the palm of his opposing hand, Guillaume wincing as a thin flow of crimson blood now flowed forth slowly from the impact. Out of the corner of his eye, he detected a sudden movement off to one side, his aim automatically shifting as he turned to identify the target. The intelligence operative's eyes widened as he realised that the shadows that were being cast on the far wall appeared now to be moving, somehow of their own accord, undulating, assembling themselves into a solid mass, roughly the size and dimensions of a human being, yet with no actual person present. Taking a nervous pace backwards, the assassin watched on as two further dark shapes also began to slowly detach themselves from the far corners of the room. Shouting out in alarm and stepping away from what was taking place, Guillaume took aim at the nearest of these hovering manifestations, firing twice, staring helplessly as the rounds from his weapon both passed directly through the advancing targets, as if breaking through the morning mist. And then, they were upon him. Even though he'd witnessed this devilry several times before, Starke could not help but feel sickened by the consequences of his actions. The younger man had failed to notice a fourth lurking shape that had slowly emerged from a dark patch of shadow that was off to his right-hand side. As the Frenchman fired wildly, the pace of the entities that approached him now dramatically increased, the one closest to him hammering into his side with great force. Seconds later, they were atop him, reaching down inside him, shadowy limbs penetrating deep through his shirt, disappearing into his chest. The assassin's screams fading away to nothing, as his internal organs were sickeningly crushed, and his ribcage violently snapped. His panicked cries replaced with a wet gurgle, as the dark matter that had once been so vital to keeping him alive now spilled forth from his lifeless mouth. Their task complete, the four shadowy outlines now moved silently backwards, coming to rest a short distance away from the horror they had just wrought, turning to face the one who'd summoned them, regarding him in a stony and unforgiving silence. Starke recognised them, each and every one of them, from the subtle outlines of the clothing they'd been wearing, each at the point of their deaths. The two British agents who tried to detain him as he'd been making his passage to safety through Switzerland. The American who'd come hunting for him after the war, seeking retribution for the events he'd set in motion at Hesse. Ever so slowly, a similar form now rose up from the broken body that lay on the ground behind them, yet another soul that had been claimed to join their ranks. There was a brief pause, a subtle change in the positioning of the five floating shapes, as the newest of their numbers slowly moved to the front. And then, they began to glide, silently across the room, towards him. As the spectral figures slowly approached, the former soldier suddenly found himself gripped by a feeling of utter helplessness. Realising the danger, he began to reach down into his pocket for the object that lay there, his mind screaming at his limbs, which appeared sluggish and reluctant to cooperate. They were close now, mere metres away, as he finally found the strength to produce the handkerchief, vigorously rubbing away at the sparkling green jewel before it. With each stroke of the material, the last traces of his blood were wiped clean from the jewel's surface, the approaching shapes losing a little more of their definition, until finally, they were all gone, leaving him standing alone in the warehouse, with only the body of his would-be assassin for company. Breathing heavily, he carefully replaced the artifact back into the cigarette case, chillingly aware of the effect it had on him, how close it had again brought him to his own death. Amidst the chaos of their surrender, he'd taken the opportunity to liberate the object from von Stahlheim's belongings, reasoning it would come in useful to aid his escape, having witnessed the Colonel use it on a number of prior occasions. But the aftermath of each use had left him weaker, slightly less coordinated, the item claiming the soul of his enemy, but coming near closer to claiming his own in the process. As he set off to make the arrangements for the young assassin's remains to be disposed of, he accepted it would be once again time for him to move on, in the hope that his enemies would eventually lose interest in him, and that he would not have to use the Colonel's mysterious possession ever again.